Named in the Geneva Conventions, this isn't a story about hate. It's a story about love. In the last 5 years, we've witnessed violence in Syria, South Sudan, Ukraine, Central African Republic, Yemen, and a score of other nations. A few of more than the 80 countries we've worked in, without fear or favour for more than 150 years. In that time, we've garnered 3 Nobel Peace Prizes, more than any other organisation in history. But this comes with losses. Every year we see colleagues caught up in the crossfire, sometimes killed or kidnapped. Amidst some of the harshest conflicts on earth, we assist with the basics of life: water, food, shelter. We work with communities to repair central infrastructure, like roads and water systems. We support people to support themselves through small businesses and loans. And we send war surgeons, nurses and doctors to where they're most needed.
We do get postage all over. Here in South Sudan, it's in civil war, and the systems are quite broken down, so there's not enough resources to care for the many people who are victims of violence and injuries. So ICRC work here is trying to mitigate that.
Today, 65 million people are fleeing conflict, more than any other time in history. For those on the move, we support them on their journey where we can. But for those who don't want to leave their homes, or can't, they remain stuck in besieged cities. Through preference or circumstance, the conditions they face can be dire.
لأنه لا بصوبة لا يعني حرامات لا بسفنجات يعني ما عندنا شيء يعني حوشنا.
We try to reach people stranded in conflicts and make sure they have what they need. The Red Cross and Red Crescent Network spans 190 countries. Through this global reach, we help families find those they've lost in the chaos of war.
Once we realized the children had no family members with them at all, we collected all the information they could give us about their families. We used the pictures of the children, we used the names of the children and the names of their family members, and this is how we managed to locate their parents, their siblings, and their grandparents.
Again and again, we connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. Connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, victims of sexual violence, and work to prevent such crimes. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. Connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, victims of sexual violence, and work to prevent such crimes. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. Connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, victims of sexual violence, and work to prevent such crimes, no matter what. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. Connect brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, victims of sexual violence, and work to prevent such crimes, no matter what. When the circumstances aren't so fortunate, our forensic experts work to bring closure and the opportunity for a dignified burial. The laws of war. We work to regulate the use of weapons, the methods of warfare, and to ensure civilians are spared. No matter who they are or what side they're on, we treat the sick and wounded.
Being an organization which is very neutral and impartial, that's what we do. So it's spontaneous. You don't even have to think about it. Anybody comes with emergency, you take them in, no question.
And in the wake of war, when weapons, bombs and mines are abandoned, we clean up what we can and help those whose lives have been changed by war regain their independence. Often first on the ground and the last to leave. Neutral, impartial and independent, we are the International Committee of the Red Cross. This isn't a story about hate. It's a story about love. In the last 5 years, we've witnessed violence in Syria, South Sudan, Ukraine, Central African Republic, Yemen, and a score of other nations. A few of more than the 80 countries we've worked in, without fear or favour for more than 150 years. In that time, we've garnered 3 Nobel Peace Prizes, more than any other organisation in history.
especially when it takes its theme on this very relevant and urgent issue for at least two reasons. First, Asia is becoming center and leader of global progress and development, not only for its economic aspect, but also in many other areas such as culture, politics, and democracy, virtue, faith, and religion. Meanwhile, Asia is the most populated continent in which China, India, and Indonesia are 3 out of 4 countries having highest population in the world. As its consequence, Asia might have complex and diverse
Icon, sorry, your voice is getting vague.
Is it clear now? Is it discontinuous our voice?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to repeat. First, Asia is becoming a center and leader of world progress and development, not only for its economic aspect, but also in many areas such as culture, politics and democracy, technology, as well as faith and religion. Meanwhile, Asia is the most populated continent in which China, India, and Indonesia are 3 out of 4 countries having highest population in the world. As its consequence, Asia might have complex and diverse societal and development problems, but at the same time, Asia also has a huge potential to contribute in solving world problem. One problem we have right now is helping the people of Asia to develop governance so that they are able to protect their citizens from acts that are inhuman or uncivilized. We all know that even in peaceful times, many people experience suffering because they are driven out from their land, imprisoned, or become refugees because of political conflict. Secondly, according to statistical data in 2017 alone, there were more than 20 million people detained for various reasons. We all understand also that the prison system is one of the oldest form of social system that have survived to this day. Our common focus is then how to guarantee basic rights and protect people who are detained, especially for those who do not have the ability to defend themselves through a fair and humane justice system. As part of Society of Jesus, Sanata Dharma, as well as the Association of Catholic, Jesuit, Catholic, and college and university in Asia-Pacific are committed to making universal apostolic preferences, or UAPs, the orientation and concern of all its members. The UAPs published by the Society of Jesus in April 2019 includes 4 concerns, and one of them is to walk with the poor, the outcasts of the world, those whose dignity has been violated, and a mission of reconciliation and justice. Therefore, I position this conference that is a collaboration between ICRC, HQAP, and Sanata Dharma University as an appropriate and timely response to the civilization call to all of us, especially in embracing one of the most complex problems. I do hope the conference become a good avenue not only to discuss our research finding, but also to facilitate a fruitful dialogue in which sharing knowledge, values, and awareness on seeking solution to overcome detention problem in Asia take place with joy and respect to each other. It is through such an orientation that we can proactively contribute to shape up our modern Asia because Asia is very important nowadays. And finally, I also hope this conference become a successful one and enjoyable one. Thank you.
Thank you, Paiko, for the encouragement. And by now, I think we conclude the opening session, and I now hand over to our moderator, Lani de la Cruz, to lead our discussion. Over to you, Lani. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Budi. Terima kasih. Good afternoon to our participants and of course to our distinguished panel of presenters for this afternoon. Welcome to the first of the three-part international webinar series on humanitarian affairs co-organized by Sanata Dharma University, the Jesuit Conference of Asia-Pacific, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. This afternoon, as mentioned by the previous speakers, we would tackle detention in Asia and the Pacific. I'm Lani de la Cruz from the ICRC in Davao City, the Philippines, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. Before we get started, allow me to go over a few items. So our participants, thank you very much, Terima kasih, for spending your 2 hours this afternoon with us. We promise to make it worth your while. So you would know how to participate in today's event because we want to make it as fruitful and productive for all of you. Webinar participants will be on default listen-only mode. Therefore, you are on mute during the entire presentation and proceeding of this webinar. If you would like to ask a question, and please, we strongly encourage you to do so, please type your question in the chat box. You can see there the chat facility. Father Bagus and our colleague in Jakarta, Ahmad Nasrullah, are managing this. You may also send your questions at any time during the presentations, and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of each presentation. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce to you first our first presenter. Julie Edwards joined the Jesuit Social Services in 2001. She was the program director prior to her appointment as Chief Executive Officer in June of 2004. Julie has over 35 years experience engaging with marginalized people and families experiencing breakdown and trauma. She is a social worker, family therapist, and a grief and loss counselor. Julie has a master's in social work and is currently completing her doctorate in this discipline. In January of 2010, Julie became a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Julie is a member of a number of national and international Jesuit commissions and working groups across areas of justice, education, social ministry, ecology, and is the leader of the Global Ignatian Justice in Mining Network. Julie is passionate about finding ways to give practical expression to her social justice values, about exploring the most effective means to build a more just society and promoting a values-based model of leadership. A virtual round of applause for our first speaker, Ms. Julie Edwards, Chief Executive Officer, Jesuit Social Services Australia. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Annie, and thank you, everyone. It's good to be with you. I appreciate the invitation, and I also appreciate to see the collaborative work across the Jesuits of Asia-Pacific from our social ministries, and I saw Adri Siadi there, who is the coordinator of the social ministries, and also across education, and of course with ICRC as well. So it's a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate that very much. Just to, I think I'll just give you a moment's introduction to Jesuit Social Services, because that is the context out of which I speak. So Jesuit Social Services belongs to the Jesuit Social Apostolate and began in 1977. So it's 43 years old. And we began working with people, and originally it was young people, but then adults as well in the criminal justice system. And we have stayed with that group all the way through. But as any of us who work in this space would know, if you work with that group and you get to know them, you come to understand that they are some of the most disadvantaged, on the whole, most disadvantaged, often despised and isolated people in the community. For example, we know that in our own context that we're talking about people. First of all, 50% of the prisoners in our situation come from just a handful of postcodes or zip codes. So in other words, disadvantage is concentrated in particular locations. And we know that the trajectory of someone into prison often is what we would call in our child protection system. So they've often experienced or witnessed family violence, perhaps abuse, including sexual abuse, separation from family, through to then the development of substance abuse problems, mental illness, etc. School exclusion. For example, in our situation in the youth justice incarceration setting, 66% have been excluded from school. So we're talking actually about, on the whole, a very disadvantaged group of people. So we're talking about poverty and disadvantage, and we would know that the narrative, the public discourse, often is much more oriented to a question of morality and the things that they have done wrong. We don't shy away from that, but we think it's worth noticing who is filling our prisons. Who are the people who are filling our prisons? And overwhelmingly, they are people who have lives of disadvantage, and overwhelmingly, they are on the bottom of society. And later, I know we're going to be talking about refugees and people seeking asylum too. And we work in that space as well. And we know that for many people, they are at the bottom of the queue too. But I can say that in Australia, there is a mixture of feelings whereby many people who are refugees or seeking asylum also have a lot of public sympathy, even though our government doesn't do so well with that at times, whereas there's very little public sympathy, I'd say, for people in the criminal justice system. So that's just a bit of background. So we started in 1977 and we've stayed with that group all the way through. So we run specific programs for young people in the youth justice system, especially when they're exiting custody, and the same in the adult system, and provide a range of services. So just to say that what I'm talking about comes from an organisation that's been working with this group closely for 43 years. We are one of the major providers of services to that group in where I live. So perhaps we could have the slide. Sure. Now, I'm not sure that I can see what's going on here. Yes, that's great. Thank you. So, as we know, Jesuit prison ministry has a long Christian history as well, and right back to in the gospel, Jesus, one of the things that, as we know, separates the sheep from the goats is about, did you visit me in prison, etc. So this is right at the heart of the concern of Christians, or it should be. And we know that also in the Jesuit tradition, it's been very important. St. Ignatius himself was imprisoned several times because of his unorthodox views, or what people were worried about, and that he was not doing the right thing, and he defended that vociferously. But it means perhaps there was, right from the beginning in the formula of the society which sets out what they're going to do, care of people in prison was important. So I think that's very interesting. It's got a long history, as I know it does with the ICRC. So what happened was, some of you here may know Fernando Franco, who was the person heading up the Social Justice Secretariat, Social Justice and Ecology Secretariat for a number of years. He visited us in Australia, and when he saw the work we were doing in prisons, he suggested that we might want to set up a forum to bring people across the world, the Jesuit network, together. And that led to our establishing in 2013 the International Jesuit Prison Network. We were aware of, for example, I had visited the Philippines prison ministry back in about 2002 or 2003. We were aware of the work that some of you may know KEP in Thailand was doing. And then we became aware of people in other places of the world, Ireland, a whole range of countries. But originally we just had 7 members. And then as we let it be known that this work was happening, more and more people came forward. And we realized that apart from significant ministries like the one in the Philippines or the one that we're doing, many, many individual Jesuits were involved in prison ministry work. Some of that might be simply going to, say, Mass or to visit prisoners. So the International Jesuit Prison Network was vibrant. I have to say it's kind of faded a bit, and we have just this year have been wanting now to promote it again. So if any of you want to find out more about that, receive the newsletter, I'd love to promote that. The reason is we think it's important that we share our stories and information across our network, but also possibly align our efforts to advocate for key issues. And one of those might be around, for example, making sure children, if they have to be imprisoned, I say children meaning people under 18, that's happened separately, or that we might be able to do campaigns, for example, around abolishing capital punishment, the death penalty. So the network itself strives for a just, humane and effective justice system in all countries that reflects the human dignity of all people. So that's the effort that we would like to do. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of an overview, I've put India in there as well, and I know India isn't in the Asia-Pacific region, but this is the typical way that imprisonment rates are measured per 100,000 of the total population. You can see the outlier there with Thailand, which appears to be largely due to their drug policies and about treatment of people with criminal offences related to drugs. You can see that Australia, for example, is kind of middle, etc. I just thought I'd paint the bigger picture first. Thank you. The next slide. That was the rate, and now here is the numbers. And of course, you know, when you see a population like China, they're going to have very big numbers. So that is the situation in terms of actual raw numbers. Thank you. Next slide. In terms of the picture across our region, in terms of separating young and adult people and the age of criminal responsibility, or otherwise called the age of criminal majority, you'll see there's a bit of a range, and again, Australia is probably around about the middle. We are campaigning vociferously at the moment to get the age of criminal responsibility lifted from 10 years old to 14. And this is the age, of course, where a majority where it is separated from the adult. So in Australia, it's 18, though in the state I work, we have a dual track system for 18 to 21-year-olds, and you can end up in the adult or the youth. It's pleasing to see countries like China and Hong Kong and Japan having quite a high age there. And we would think that people should be treated as children with, we know now around brain development goes on well into the 20s, but we would like to see younger people separated from adults for as long as possible. Thank you. Next slide. Right, the next one, thanks. So just to touch on the topic of capital punishment, Australia doesn't use capital punishment. In the state where I live, it was the last hanging was in the 60s, and it was abolished in all jurisdictions by 1985. So we'll look at the next slide to see where death penalty still exists in the Asia-Pacific region. Oh, no, we won't, but I'll tell you. So we still have in Vietnam, Thailand, Japan, Singapore, the Philippines, and China. And we know that China particularly remains the leading executioner. We don't have numbers out of China. We have official numbers, but we know that they're underrepresented. It's believed perhaps by thousands. In the last year, we actually had a decrease in the number of people who were executed, a slight decrease. And that was, we don't have the numbers we still find it hard to get numbers for Vietnam, China, and North Korea. But Singapore reduced the number of people who were executed from 13 to 4, Japan from 15 to 3, for example. So we did have a slight shift last year, and I'd be very interested to know if people wanted to work on that issue. Malaysia has continued to observe its official moratorium on executions that they established in July 2018, which is also pleasing. Perhaps I'll move on to the Australian prisons now, just to give you a picture for here. So in Australia, there are about 43, the next slide, yes, thank you, 43,000 adult prisoners. At the moment, with a rate of 219 per 100,000. And as you saw, that was the middle of the range. I'd be very interested later, people may be able to comment, but in Australia, males represent 92, sometimes it's 93, sometimes it's 94% of the prison population. Just to draw attention to that, I think that's a very interesting statistic. And as a result of that, Jesuit Social Services recently started a new program called the Men's Project, because we observed, as we all know, that 95% of violent acts, the perpetrator was male. In Australia, 1 woman a week is murdered by a partner or ex-partner. But we also know that men in lots of ways aren't traveling very well themselves. For example, in Australia, they suicide at 6 times the rate of women. Then about 80% of the people who get excluded from school from bad behaviour. So we've got an issue about gender here that I just want to put on the agenda for us, and maybe we can get to discuss that later. Recidivism is 46.4%. So that means that within 2 years of being released from prison, someone will be back inside. So I think it's fair enough to say that it's not working. What we're doing is not working. If within 2 years, 46.4% of people are locked up again. Another serious important statistic is that 1/3 of prisoners are unsentenced. So that means they are on remand, they are awaiting conviction or sentencing. We know that many of those prisoners don't get bail or aren't released because they don't have somewhere to live, not to do with the seriousness of their crime. And many, in fact, then are not found guilty. So they have spent time in prison unnecessarily. It's to Australia's shame that prisoners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, that is our Indigenous people, account for 28% of the prison population, despite being only 3% of the general population. So in other words, they're 12 times more likely to be imprisoned. And just to point out again, the age of criminal responsibility is 10, and we say that no primary school age child should be in school, and we're doing national advocacy around that. Thank you. Finally, I was asked to comment on the situation of COVID. So COVID has seen actually in 2 states, the state I live in Victoria, and another state, a dramatic drop of prisoners, down from 8,000 to 7,000. And that's not because of a change in legislation. Actually, it's the judges and the magistrates are choosing, rather than putting someone on remand in that unsentenced way, to release them into the community pending their court case. And we have used this very much as an opportunity to advocate, which indicates to me that they shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. So we are saying that a country like Norway, for example, you don't get into prison if you have a sentence of under 2 years. In other words, if it's a non-violent offence, you won't be locked up. So we're advocating for that where we are. We think that we could reduce prison numbers extensively if we reserved it. We believe it should be an option of last resort, and if we reserved it for people who have committed violent crimes. So we'd like to see others released, especially people on short-term sentences who cycle in and out. So what we saw is during the height of the pandemic, 6 prisons in the state where I live out of an 8 were locked down when staff contracted COVID-19. So we saw people in isolation or solitary confinement, whole prisons of people, not because they had misbehaved or anything else, but because of needing to maintain the status quo in terms of health. And we understand that. But we also point out that it's a very difficult situation. We've done research around the effects of solitary confinement on people, especially on young people, and it's quite devastating. The final thing I'll just say, it is possible to do something different because of COVID and because of 50% of prisoners in Victoria, in Melbourne, exiting into homelessness. The government wanted to do something different because they've been trying to get homeless people properly housed during this time. And what that led to a pilot project where a former immigration detention centre was turned into a housing facility, and Jesuit Social Services works with prisoners who are released from prison in that place for 6 months, helping up to 6 months, helping to get them longer term a stable accommodation. And looking after mental illness and other problems. So we're very pleased. So it's, in other words, it's a step down facility from jail. And we believe that we need those sort of facilities to actually help people transition back into the community in a safer and more successful way. And this is the sort of initiative that we would like to see continue and expand post-COVID. So we think COVID has actually shone a light on a couple of things. One, we don't need to be locking up as many people. And 2, we can provide better services for them when they get out to help have a successful transition back into the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Julie of the Jesuit Social Services in Australia. Thank you for sharing to us quite surprising statistics, and as well as the 2 main points of not needing to lock up so many people and providing the support for them whenever they exit the penitentiary or the detention facilities. We would like to encourage all of you, if you would like to know more about the work that Ms. Julie and her staff are doing under the Jesuit Social Services in Australia, please type in your questions. And Father Bagus and our colleague Nash, they are manning our chat rooms, our chat room, our chat box. If ever you have comments, you have suggestions, you have clarifications in relation to the talk given by Ms. Julie, please type it in. You can type anytime, and then our colleagues will be collecting that. If you have any questions, we will endeavor to have them answered immediately after the presentation. So Father Bagus is now ready to take in your questions and would present them and raise them to Ms. Julie on International Jesuit Prison network. If you want to receive the newsletter, you can also request that from them. Also, Ms. Julie, can you promote your website if ever our participants would like to know more about the work that you do? I'll give to you the floor to promote the social media platforms of the Jesuit Social Services. Over to you, ma'am.
Did you want me now? Sorry, did you want me now to do that? I've just typed in some information, but would you, in the chat room, do you want me to explain?
If you can mention, Ms. Julie, some of the platforms that our participants can access if they want to find out more about the work, the important work that you do in Australia.
Okay, so I've just put out my email in case anyone wants to find out about the International Jesuit Prison Network. If you want to receive the newsletter, our website is www.jss for Jesuit Social Services, jss.org.au. And what I'll do is I'll type in later some of our social media things, which I can get, which I never remember them because I just do them on my phone. So I'll type them in as well and send them round. Thanks, Lani.
Thank you so much, Ms. Julie. And please, if you want to find out more about Ms. Julie and their work in Australia, she will be putting later on the social media platforms as well as her email address. So thank you for being so generous with that. Now, we move forward to our second speaker. But before that, if you have just entered the webinar or the room, welcome to all of you. Magandang hapon. I'm sorry, I do not know how to say it in Bahasa, but good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for taking time to join us in the first of the three-part international webinar series co-organized by Sanata Dharma University, the Jesuit Conference for Asia-Pacific, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Our speaker, allow me to introduce him because he comes from Qatar. He is from the Philippines. So Father Eli Rodi Y. Lumbo, SJ, is the Executive Director of the Philippine Jesuit Prison Foundation, Incorporated. He is a certified public accountant before heeding the call and earned his bachelor in sacred theology from the Loyola School of Theology, Ateneo de Manila University, and pursued master's studies in philosophy from the same institution. He has had strong experience as a missionary for the indigenous Filipinos in Bukidnon, Mindanao, and held a number of vital positions in various Jesuit ministries and offices. He brings with us this afternoon more than 20 years wealth of experience in the prison ministry from the Philippines. Aside from his official designation as Executive Director, Father Eli is also teaching accounting inside the Bilibid prison and is passionate in writing and sharing stories of reformation and inspiration through his blog. Ladies and gentlemen, a big virtual round of applause for our speaker, for our second speaker, Father Eli Rodi Lumbo, SJ, Executive Director of the Philippine Jesuit Prison Services Foundation. Over to you, Father Eli.
So, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As I was listening to Julie earlier, I got honored to hear about her and being part of the Jesuit Prison Network. But this is the first time I saw her virtually. Anyway, compared to Julie, who's been in ministry for 35 years, I'm just almost 10 years now in the prison ministry, although the foundation that I am in is 26 years now. Just to start, first slide, please. When I was invited to speak at this forum, I was thinking about what to or how to do it. I just accepted the invitation because I know this is really an opportunity to share the ministry and to talk about it. As Lani mentioned earlier, I'm really passionate about sharing stories of change and really testimonials here at prison. So I'd like to start with this slide. The dignity of the human person is rooted in his creation in the image and likeness of God. In my almost 10 years here now, I've always spoken with what we call here the persons deprived of liberty, or PDLs. There's always a sense of they look at themselves really as not worth anything. There's many of them. So that I always tell them if trash or garbage or virus have value, what more for people like them, for us who are created in the image and likeness of God. It's always something that I remind them of. And next slide, please. And okay, I write there the effect of sin or crime on man's dignity. A few months ago during this pandemic, I was asked by a teacher in the Ateneo de Manila, where I was previously assigned, to give a short talk on the dignity of man's dignity. What happens to it if man commits a crime or is imprisoned? And I say it's still there. That's why we in the Philippine Jesuit Prison Service try to remind the people inside that it is there. They have to value themselves. They have to help themselves if they want us to help them as well. Next slide, please. I wrote this. This is an excerpt of an article I wrote in the Jesuit magazine here in the Philippines, which is released quarterly. And I also shared a part of this in the talk that I was asked to deliver in the Loyola School of Theology during a theological hour a few years ago. I wrote, "Doing prison ministry is not easy. Each time I enter the prison camp, I do not know what to expect. After all, there are almost 30,000 inmates in the National Penitentiary. As I cannot possibly minister to each one, I do what I can to those who approach me, or to those who are referred to by the employees of the Bureau of Corrections or by their fellow inmates as well. I do not ask the PDLs or the inmates what religion they belong to. It's not really part of the basic questions. The most important questions is what do they need and what help do they need? And if we can help them, we will help them. Since it does not matter if they're Catholics or not. What is important is they're, at the end of the day, children of God, and they need help. We will help them. So in my ministry, I make it a point not to judge the inmates, as I do not know their real and complete story. This is the reason why I share stories, why I write about stories, about experiences here in the prison, about reflections in my interactions with the PDLs, in what I see as happening to them, in their own reflections and their stories. That's why I tell people, family and friends, and whenever I'm invited to give talks, nowadays through Zoom or Messenger, that we should not judge a person just because he or she is in prison. We really have to know their story. And from there, understand them. Lots of the people inside the prison here in the penitentiary grew up in the streets. A number of them don't even belong to any families that they really know. So that in my ministry, one of the questions I even ask them is their own family, their own upbringing, where they grew up. Majority of these people come from poor families, and a good number have not had a good education or any education at all. As Lani mentioned earlier, I also teach at the penitentiary in the college, but I know for a fact that there are some PDLs who did not know how to read or write when they were incarcerated, and they only got to know to learn to read and to write when they chose to study inside. Thus, I would not begrudge them their choices. I would not make the prejudices of their society the basis of how I deal with supposed criminals. As a priest, for over 20 years now, I'm invited to enter the world of the convicted felon. And as I enter the world, I come face to face with my own sin and my need for God's mercy. Next slide, please. So allow me to speak about the Philippine Jesuit Prison Service, or PJPS. Just some pictures inside the prison camps. Next slide, please. So just to put everything into context, we're based here in the New Bilibid Prison here in Muntinlupa City. The reservation covers 587 hectares of land with the following prison compounds and their population. The maximum camp has, as of October 2020, 17,909 PDLs. They wear orange shirts inside. The people who are in the maximum camp have been convicted for crimes, and their penalties are 20 years and above. And there are also recidivists there. In the medium camp, we have 8,114. They wear blue shirts inside. It's where the education, the training education division is complete from basic education of the college. The next, we have the minimum camp. We have 1,466. Most of the PDLs here are elderly. They wear brown shirts. And the reception and diagnostic center, this is where the newly convicted PDLs are brought. Once they are convicted by the courts, they're brought here for 2 to 3 months, and they stay there until they're transferred to the maximum or medium camp. So the total PDLs here in the New Bilibid prison is 28,371. And then in the CIW, which is the Correctional Institution for Women, which is based in Mandaluyong, we also go there and we also help there. There are 3,358 female inmates. So the total population under the Bureau of Corrections is 32,060. But with CIW, the total is 31,729. But there are returnees here. The returnees are those who were asked by, or perhaps demanded by our president, they were already released. But there were some issues about the GCTA, or the Good Conduct and Time Allowance Law. So our president asked that they surrender back to the prison. So there were actually more than 1,000 who surrendered, but up to this point, there are still 331 here in the New Bilibid prison. Out of this 331, there are many in the, there are 156 in the minimum camp, 166 in the medium camp, and 9 female inmates in CIW. So we have a total of 32,060 PDLs and returnees here in the Bureau of Corrections. Okay, what do we do? Next slide, please. Our mission, a ministry that shares the transforming love and mercy of God through the holistic rehabilitation of incarcerated persons, their families, and the prison community as a whole. So it is not just the PDLs inside the prison, inside the camps, or those behind the walls or within the walls, but we also work with their families because there are many families who have since relocated here inside the reservation. They have left their provinces, their places, and they found work in the area or around the nearby provinces or cities. And they were since transferred here and have gone, their children study around the area. Our vision, a society that rebuilds lives, rekindles hope, and restores dignity in all those affected by incarceration. This is our tagline, really, something that we repeat so often. Our hope is to rebuild lives, rekindle hope, and restore dignity. Really, if one works, when one gets to be exposed in the prison ministry, one gets to be exposed in the reality of life inside prison, it is really important to rebuild the lives of these people, their own families, and to give them hope. I was having my manifestation in provincial a few months ago, and he mentioned that really one of the important things that we need to do, especially during this pandemic, is to identify hope-filled experiences. And I believe that those in prison, this is important. And lastly, to restore dignity. Next slide, please. I'd like to give you somehow just a brief history of PJPS. It was established it really started with an immersion really of one of the Jesuits here in 1987. He had a brother who was incarcerated here. That's why it was, I would say, a grace-filled experience because the Philippine Jesuits had no work really here in the prison ministry before 1987, but because of the immersion of the Jesuit here in 1987, he began working here, coming here every Sunday. And I was, even when I was a candidate for the society still in 1989, I came here every Sunday and interacted with the inmates, not knowing that when I got ordained years after, I would be assigned here. And I've been here almost, again, as I mentioned, 10 years already. Then in 1993, it became an official apostolate of the province. And in 1994, a year after, it became the Philippine Jesuit Prison Service. And since then, up to this time, we have been one of those at the forefront of lobbying against death penalty. It has since been abolished, but our current president wants to reimpose it again. So you're still at the forefront of that with the coalition of different organizations working against death penalty. And in 2004, we helped in the construction of chapels inside the prison camps, the renovation inside the camps as well. And the Child Free Bilibid, supporting the Juvenile Welfare Act in 2004. Even the water supply here, we were part of we really organized the construction of deep wells inside to provide water for the PDLs. Next slide, please. Then in 2011, we organized the formation of the inmate parents. We have a scholarship program. I'll go into detail later. But the SMI stands for Samahan ng mga Magulang ng Scholar. So organization of the parents of our scholars. So our scholars are children of inmates. So we realized early on that Father Viclaba, who was the founder of PJPS, saw that there were many children inside the prison camps and they should be in their schools. So that's why he put up the scholarship program, really not knowing at that point if he had the funds for it, but God has provided and God has continually provided for us here. So we realized that if we just focus on the children, it would not be that effective unless we take on also the parents, those who are inside the prison camps, and those who are with them outside. So that's why that's the formation of the inmate parents. So we meet with them before the pandemic. We met with them regularly to have a formation program for them. Then in 2012, we were part of the Innocence Project Philippines Network to help legally those wrongly convicted, at least science-based, trying to really look into the science of their incarceration, finding proofs that they are really truly innocent. And 2 years ago, we also bought submersible pumps for the prison camps, because especially in RDC, it was 4 or 5 months before they were able to get water again. It was really pitiable for them who did not have water supply inside the camps. So really a part of what we do is to help them deal with their situation inside. And in 2019, last year, we celebrated our 25th year here in Bureau of Corrections as their partner here. And this year, COVID response. I'll go into detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So our programs here, basically we have 3 major programs. The social pastoral, which deals with the holistic rehabilitation. We attend to the medical, communication, legal, spiritual needs of the PDLs. Many of them, as I mentioned early on, belong to poor families. So sometimes, or many times really, a number of PDLs approach me or the staff when they were still able to enter the prison compounds, and they ask us to mail their letters for them, especially for the Board of Pardon and Parole, and to the courts, regional trial courts. The next is a scholarship program. We sponsor the education of PDL's children to give families hope for a more stable future. and we conduct formation sessions for them. We did this monthly for both the scholars and their parents who were not in prison. So the parents or guardians who are with them. And next is the advocacy program. So we facilitate immersions, propose prison reforms that are needed, especially because we are aware of what happens inside, we are immersed inside. So we also deal with issues that we propose to the give corrections and what to do. And we coordinate with also like the CBCP on concerns that have to be made aware to the community outside. Okay, next slide, please. So the first social pastor program. There are 3 parts to this program. The first is the health services. So basically, we have dental missions, optical missions, and the medical mission or general checkups. There's a hospital inside the prison camp, but it's under renovation now. So what the status is, the inmates or the PDLs are really in what is called right now a tent city. So they're divided depending on their sickness. They divide in different tents, and they stay in the tents since the hospital is under renovation. Before, the hospital just accommodated around 500 PDLs. So now it's been renovated so it can accommodate more PDLs. Okay, next slide, please. Second part of the social pastor program is the social services. So we have the weekly feeding programs for the elderly especially, and we have the Oplan Dalaw. The Oplan Dalaw is like visitation. So we have volunteers. A big part really of our foundation, why I would say succeed in what we do, is our volunteers. We have so many volunteers from different walks of life, different career orientations. They come here regularly and help in our different programs. And one of those programs is the Oplan Dalaw or Operation Dalaw or Operation Visitation. This started a few years ago when I was talking with several inmates, and a number of inmates, and they were saying that they've had no visits or no interaction with their parents or their families for 10, 20 years. And it started with that. I really felt for them. There was one of the first batches that we had is that this PDL who has since been released now was not able to see his mother for 25 years. And he was saying that when he was in prison, he really didn't want anything to do with his parents because he said he believed that it was only him who sinned, who committed the crime, and he's the only one to suffer. But I asked him, you say that, but your mother has been suffering. Really, I felt the pain of the mother. Excuse me. And so that we brought my mother here. So on that, the day that she came, I could just, she was repeatedly saying, my son, anak, anak. And the son was all repeatedly saying, sorry, sorry. It was like a scene from the prodigal son, the father embracing the son. But here was the mother embracing, kissing the son repeatedly. Next slide, please. And the third part of the social pastor program is pastoral services. And ever since the establishment of PGPS since 1994, there have been 2 Jesuits assigned here, Jesuit priests. So we do masses every day, affirmation sessions for Catholics, and as I mentioned earlier, do some education. So we teach. Next slide, please. In the scholarship program, we provide scholars opportunities that can help in the development and integration of the personal, academic, and spiritual life. Our reality here in the Philippines is when a parent or both parents are in prison. What happens to the education of the child? It stops. And that's very sad. We believe here at PJPS that one way to stop the cycle of criminality and poverty is to help a child continue and finish his education. That is hope-giving, not just to the PDL, but also to the child himself or herself, and to the family, so that we truly make it a point to help the families and to help them also face the stigma that is that they face also when a family member is incarcerated. So part of the formation programs that we do monthly is to talk about that. And so we have counseling also with the scholars and their families also. Next slide, please. Then the third program is the advocacy program. So as mentioned, we have community engagements or immersions, we have linkages with different groups and alliance building, different organizations, so that we, as it would be said, we are stronger in making our advocacies, in fighting for our advocacies, especially the death penalty. I was invited as a resource person, signed up several times, also in Congress, when they were talking about the death penalty. Next slide, please. Prison awareness. Right now, actually, we're celebrating the Prison Awareness Week, the 33rd Prison Awareness Week, and in the Bureau of Corrections, the National Correctional Consciousness Week, the 26th one. So I was telling, sorry, when I was invited to this, maybe I said yes, because this is really part of our advocacy to talk about prison awareness during this week. Next slide, please. This is our current project, really, to give SOAP. SOAP stands for Simple Offering of Affection for PDS. We feel that this is very important, especially now with the COVID pandemic. Although nowadays the Bureau of Corrections has been able to provide SOAP for PDS, but the fact is it is not really that regular. So we have to hope to provide them SOAP, and somehow they then feel that they are remembered, they are prayed for, they are cared. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so now we move on to the COVID response. I just like to show pictures here of what donations that have been arriving here in PJPS or in Bilibid. So you have there in the left side, face masks, vitamins, in the middle, tons of carrots, squash, and all sorts. Really, it was really amazing how donations came in frequently and the volume that came here. And on the right side, you have there sacks of rice, and then on the lower right, mattresses for the PDLs. Okay, next slide, please. This is an update of our COVID response here in Bilibid. So this is as of September 30, 2020. So up to that point, up to that date, we have distributed more than 12.9 million worth of donations. So as you see on the legend, the orange one is for the PDLs, so for the inmates. We have distributed 9.2 million in the form of office and other supplies, construction materials, vitamins, over-the-counter medicines, toiletries, pens, and all the works. And the blue is for the frontliners of the Bureau of Corrections, and on the left, on the yellow, is the families of the PDLs. There are many families who reside here within the reservation. Okay, so I'd like to speak about the financial assistance, because most, if not all, of the families, their livelihood were affected because of the COVID-19 virus, the pandemic. So there was really no money to buy food, nothing. So what we did was to find help for them so that they at least can buy food for their families, put food in the table. Okay, next slide, please. So pictures again, we distributed mattresses to the PDLs. In the past, really a huge number of them just slept on the floors. Or the past weeks, we've been distributing cardboard boxes for them, and it's really amazing how they are happy with even a simple boxes of cartons to sleep on. Something to remind us of simplicity of life, really. On the right, we have food packs for the families. Okay, next slide, please. We have their pictures, vitamins. On the upper middle, we have a picture of a food pack. Since May 1st, we've been distributing food packs to the frontliners here. In the first 2 or 3 months, we have been distributing food packs for around 400 frontliners every day. And up to this point, 105 food packs for the frontliners who are manning the gates of the prison compounds. On the lower right, you have the picture of the folding beds and pillows for the elderly PDLs. So it was really amazing for me when I saw that this place was arranged for the elderly and compared to a very congested cells that they had before. Next slide, please. Since the middle of March 15, there have been no masses inside the prison camps, and a big part of rehabilitation is really the spiritual activities inside, and this is inside the medium security camp. It was only once in the past 7 months that we have been able to celebrate mass, and this was on the birthday of Our Lady of Mama Mary. And it was really inspiring how people reacted to the celebration. It's like they were really hungry for it. Next slide, please. At the end of the day, I'd like to share this quote from Attorney Jacqueline Antigua, a CHR spokesperson. She says, "At the end of the day, crimes must be punished, but there remains an inherent obligation of the government to uphold everyone's dignity, especially those who are eyed to be reformed." And I'd like to add, really, reformation is not just a government's responsibility. It is all ours, the family and society in general, in each of us. So that actually during this pandemic, it has been inspiring in a way to know and to hear people wanting to help those in prison or remembering those in prison. I received a number of texts and messages or calls and asking me how can they help because they have not helped anyone in prison before. And the pandemic made them realize or remember those in prison. And I think although the pandemic has brought us so much hurts or pain, so much many changes in our lives, one grace that we have been made aware of is really the generosity of people and sensitivity of people to those who are in prison. Okay, next slide, please. And I'd like to end with this, from a quote from Albert Schweitzer. "At times our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us." And I think, I believe it truly, sincerely in this. Volunteers are the sparks who give us hope, who give us reason to do what we do and continue doing what we do, especially in the pandemic. And I think this opportunity to speak, this invitation by ICRC to speak to the group is also a spark in its own, to help us realize that really the battle against the pandemic and the concern for those incarcerated, for those detained, is a global concern. And bringing us together is grace in itself. ICRC has been helpful here in the penitentiary because one of the main workers in a way who have helped put up the site Haii, where the COVID-19, those who have been infected by the virus are placed. It's where the education, the classrooms are, and the chapel are, but now has been converted to the isolation compound. But ICRC has been on the forefront of that. So I'm hopeful to this, the possibilities of really interacting more, working more with ICRC, because I know in my heart, in my mind, that we can do more for those in person, and thus be more effective in what we do and show care and concern for them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Eli. We will allow you a drink of water to clear your throat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So while you are taking your sip of water, thank you so much to those who have shared their comments and their questions. So for Miss Julie, we have something here, a question from you. And by the way, shout out to Father Bagus and our ICRC colleague Nash for manning our chat room. So aside from housing assistance, Miss Julie, is there a program for employment for ex-inmates? I believe the participant was referring to the transient housing support that JSS is providing the ex-inmates. So the question is there a program for employment after? So I turn it over to you, Ms. Julie, to answer.
Thank you. Yes, there is. We try to work with other organisations to get everyone into work. Many people don't, as we've heard from Ellie's presentation too, many people are functionally illiterate or innumerate, actually. So often there's some skill development that needs to be done. But yes, we have a program for just a small amount of prisoners that we're trialling, working with big corporations that are doing infrastructure, things like roads, building roads and tunnels. And the program is called Out for Good, meaning that they're out, for good forever, and that they're going to go and do some good. So yes, we do have some employment programs too.
Thank you so much for your response, Ms. Julie. And by the way, thank you for sharing the social media platforms of Jesuit Social Services. To our participants, it's reflected in our chat room, so you may want to take note of that, because after the webinar, you can visit. Also for the Philippine Jesuit Prison Services Foundation, you may access them at www.pjps.org.ph. So I'm just saying this, Father Eli. Also comment, dear Father Eli, great to hear from you on your service to the prisoners and their families, the persons deprived of liberty. Do you have a network or office in Sri Lanka? And if they are also doing the same work there, Father Eli, what's the answer?
Sorry, I'm not aware of prison work in Sri Lanka. Perhaps Julie would be aware of that. But at least the PJPS, the organization I'm working with here, is just focused in the Philippines. But we try to coordinate with the other networks around the country, around the world, like Julie mentioned, the Jesuit Prison Network.
I could just say I can check whether we have anyone on our mailing list from Sri Lanka. If you want to follow up with me, I put my email there as well.
Thank you so much, Ms. Julie and Father Eli. So Father Eli mentioned earlier in his talk about the important work that ICRC does in detention. So now is the time for our third speaker. Seri is a prison system advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross. He is based in Manila, where he provides support to ICRC delegations and detaining authorities in the Philippines and Malaysia to address systemic humanitarian concerns in places of detention. Seri has been working in the corrections sector for over 25 years and retired from the Correctional Service of Canada in 2017 as the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Correctional Operations for the Pacific. Why did he retire? It is to pursue his passion for international work. Over his career with a CSC, Terry held various positions, including Director of Operations for the Pacific and Warden of 3 different federal institutions. So Terry holds a Master's of Arts in Human Security and Peace Building from Royal Roads University with a focus on rule of law and post-conflict correctional reform, as well as a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Trinity Western University. Currently, he is completing his Master's of Advanced Studies in International Law of Armed Conflict from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pride to present to you our third speaker, Terry Norris Hackett from the ICRC region based in Manila. A virtual round of applause, please. Over to you, Sir Terry.
Good day, and thank you so much, Lani, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to Father Ellie and Julie for your informative presentations and for the excellent work of both your organizations. What a privilege it is to be here today to share a bit of work about what we do with the ICRC in detention. But before we go into some of the work of the ICRC has been doing in the Asian Pacific, I'd like to provide you with a bit of background on why and how the ICRC works in detention. So if we can get the slides up, that would be great. Perfect. So if we can go into the first slide. The next one there. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. So guided by our fundamental principles that Dominic mentioned in his opening remarks, in particular humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, the ICRC has been working to improve the humanitarian conditions of detention since 1870. Traditionally, we focused on visiting detainees who are held in connection to armed conflict or other situations of violence, given the mandate that was given to us by the international community under the Geneva Conventions. However, where we can, we take an all-detainee approach and visit people detained for other reasons, including for criminal and administrative matters. So why does the ICRC work in detention? As we all know, detainees are vulnerable to forced disappearance, vulnerable to ill treatment, such as abuse or torture, and vulnerable to the conditions they are being held in. The ICRC, through our visits to places of detention and ongoing dialogue with detaining authorities, we seek to reduce this vulnerability and secure humane conditions of detention for people deprived of liberty, regardless of the reason for their detention. So what do we do when we visit a place of detention? Prior to visiting, ICRC enters into an agreement with the detaining authorities regarding the specific modalities that we will follow during a visit. This includes having access to all areas where detainees are held and live out their day-to-day lives, the ability to confidentially interview detainees, and we also need to be able to come back, that is, to make repeat visits. During our visits, we also engage in discussions with prison staff and other stakeholders. Another cornerstone of our work in detention is to re-establish contact between detainees and their families where that contact has been lost. This includes facilitating phone calls and delivering Red Cross messages between detainees and their families. By adhering to our fundamental principles and our modalities, the ICRC is able to gain a unique 360-degree perspective on a place of detention, and as a result, conduct a comprehensive assessment of the humanitarian issues and challenges within that facility. At the end of the visit, we have a confidential dialogue with the prison warden or the director of the facility, and we share with them our overall findings and discuss some solutions. We also make practical recommendations based on international standards such as the Nelson Mandela Rules or Bangkok Rules, and in some cases provide direct support to improve the humanitarian conditions within that facility. Next slide, please. In 2019, in Asia Pacific, we conducted 517 detention visits to 267 places of detention in 11 countries. The places of detention that we visited held over 290,000 detainees, and we were able to conduct individual follow-up with over 4,000 of them. In addition, as part of our work to restore family links, we delivered over 5,000 Red Cross messages and facilitated 718 phone calls for detainees in jails, prisons, and immigration detention facilities. At each of these places of detention, we work closely with the wardens or directors of the facility to try to improve the conditions of detention. Next slide, please. However, we recognize that many humanitarian issues in a place of detention are complex and are often outside the authority of a specific warden or director. This includes many of the common challenges that the ICRC has observed in places of detention within the region. This includes overcrowding, difficulties in terms of the conditions of confinement, law and policy gaps in various countries' law and policy, prison infrastructure, aging infrastructure, a lack of staff to deliver basic services to detainees and gaps in their training, provision of access to healthcare, of course, is also a significant concern that we see throughout the region. Therefore, along with the recommendations that we make directly to the prison warden on issues that can be addressed at his or her level, we then often work at what we call the systemic level. This could be with the central or national prison authorities, other government departments such as the Ministry of Health, courts, or even legislators. Depending on the issue that we are trying to jointly address with authorities, the ICRC's unique multidisciplinary technical expertise can be applied in various areas such as healthcare, judicial guarantees, prison management, and infrastructure. By working at multiple levels of a system of detention, we're able to help find sustainable solutions to the benefit of detainees and their families. I'd like to now share just a few examples of our systemic work throughout the region over the past several years. We can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of improving conditions of detention, a few examples here are Myanmar, Cambodia, and the Philippines. In Myanmar, in support of our efforts to help restore family links for persons deprived of their liberty, we have supported authorities in the construction of new family visitation areas. In Cambodia, we've worked with the prison department to help provide facilities to prepare food for detainees in a safe and hygienic manner. In the Philippines, in 2018, the ICRC helped the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology craft the minimum standards for the design of BJMP jails. This document now guides the design and build of new facilities, taking into account international standards such as the Mandela Rules, as well as local building codes and operational needs of the Bureau. Next slide, please. In regards to health and detention, again, I'll speak here about the Philippines first. Over the last many years, our teams have done extensive work on increasing the capacity of Bucor and the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology to identify and treat tuberculosis in jails and prisons, which is a significant concern here in the Philippines. In Cambodia, we have worked with detainee authorities to help strengthen access to healthcare in places of detention. And in Papua New Guinea, we worked with the Papua New Guinea Correctional Service to design a standard approach to initial health screening for all newly admitted detainees. Next slide, please. Now, tackling overcrowding is a very complex issue, as you well can imagine, and one of the key aspects of that is focusing on judicial guarantees. In Sri Lanka, we have worked to help support the formation of a government task force to reduce overcrowding in prisons. In the Philippines, we help to design electronic training modules for paralegals that help to increase the capacity for these critical members of the BJMP who have a key component in the efforts to reduce overcrowding in BJMP jails. And our efforts to address the root causes of overcrowding go beyond detaining authorities. In Cambodia, our experts provided training of court clerks to help increase the capacity of courts and to expedite various processes. Next slide, please. And some other examples of our systemic support in Cambodia, again, we have worked with local partners to increase detainee access to education and vocational training. In Malaysia, we have done quite a bit of work with the Malaysia Prison Department and the Immigration Authority to provide professional development to prison staff around the Nelson Mandela Rules and other international standards. In Myanmar, we have worked with the government to look at legislation and policy reform to bring into compliance with international standards. And also in Bangladesh, we've provided prison management training looking at how prison management can be applied through the lens, again, of international standards. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, 9 months ago, this, as with every one around the world, I think snuck up on everyone. And this is, of course, been our focus in detention for the past 9 months throughout the region. In this region and around the world, COVID-19 has compounded an already existing humanitarian crisis in many places of detention. In many contexts, especially those facing armed conflict, this is another layer of despair placed on top of those that detainees were already facing on a daily basis prior to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Here's a few key issues and challenges that we've observed globally and within this region in terms of the struggles of COVID-19 in places of detention. So, as I mentioned, there's an existing humanitarian crisis that was already there way before COVID-19. This includes overcrowding and goes beyond the obvious critical issues such as the inability to social distance in places of detention and the lack of available hygiene that we're all aware of. We've heard about those in the news and we're aware of those issues. We're also seeing COVID-19 impact pretty much every aspect of the criminal justice system, arrests, sentencing, and releases. As a result, many contexts have struggled to manage the inflow in a safe manner, inflow of detainees into various places of detention in a safe manner, let alone formulate an integrated approach to help decongest or depopulate efforts as a part of the COVID-19 response. Prior to COVID-19, there was already a lack of access to basic needs and services, as well as human resources to facilitate safe and humane detention. And these issues have only grown during COVID. Compounding this further is that detention systems have traditionally been at the bottom of the priority for funding and resources. Now, with the economic impact of the pandemic on governments around the region, and again around the globe, we're concerned that funding will even be more strained for those essential services for detainees. In terms of infrastructure, generally, there's a lack of functional space inside of places of detention. Prisons and jails were not designed to have space necessarily for quarantine on arrival or for medical isolation due to a pandemic. Often they struggle just to provide space for basic living conditions. Oftentimes, the only space available to transform into isolation or quarantine facilities are recreational, educational, or vocational areas, resulting in the loss of activities that are critical to all detainees' well-being and their mental health. And of course, their mental health is already being strained by the uncertainty and further restrictions of COVID-19 that are happening throughout the region, including a lack of face-to-face contact with their families, because family visitation has often been suspended as one of the COVID restrictions. From a health perspective, when the crisis began, in many contexts, there was limited, if any, pre-existing connections between the prison health authorities and public health authorities. And many prison health systems had worked without external support or connections to their public health counterparts for decades. This public health emergency has now forced public and prison health systems to connect, but both are still having trouble adapting given the scope of the challenges and once again the lack of resources, because obviously COVID-19 is impacting the community as well as places of detention, and resources are limited, of course. Inside the prisons, operationally, prison managers and frontline staff have been forced to rethink every part of the detention system, from intake to release and everything in between in a very short period of time. For example, detention staff and wardens are having to look at everything through the lens of infection prevention and control, rethinking intake screening, how to do quarantine, food chain, how does the food get to the prison, how do they distribute it inside of the prison in a safe manner, access to hand hygiene points, access to hygiene materials, access to fresh air even, and exercise, and of course, rethinking how family visiting can occur in a safe manner. Everything has changed and systems have been forced to innovate. This includes video visitation and electronic court hearings. In some contexts, we've seen initiatives that would normally take years to pilot, such as video visitation and again, electronic court hearings. They've been introduced and rolled out in a very short period of time, in a matter of months. However, challenges do remain in terms of the implementation, and continued innovation is required by detaining authorities to ensure solutions are sustainable and effective. Detention systems have also had to be innovative in redesigning the flow of the institutions, intakes, assessments, and other processes, as well as reallocating resources, both human and financially, to address COVID-19. Next slide, please. So building on our extensive experience working to improve conditions of detention in Asia and Pacific, our ICRC teams have been supporting authorities in several contexts in the region in their response to COVID-19 in places of detention. As part of our efforts, we've entered into high-level dialogue with governments and detainee authorities and provided recommendations and technical advice to help support the response to the benefit of detainees. This includes providing technical advice and input into agencies' standard operating procedures, government-wide initiatives to address COVID-19 in place of detention, and other confidential recommendations that have been made to various governments in the region. We've also focused on the individual needs of detainees through the provision of support to restoring family links to help mitigate the impacts of the suspension of face-to-face visitation that has occurred in many jurisdictions. In terms of our visits to places of detention, where possible, we have used an adapted approach to monitor conditions inside of places of detention. Mostly, either through remote discussions, but also through visiting our teams visiting places of detention, utilizing infection prevention control measures, full PPE, and still ensuring that we can have that connection and those confidential discussions with detainees and with prison authorities in a safe manner. Also, our forensic teams have provided technical advice, training, and material support to help authorities ensure the remains of those who may have passed away as a result of COVID are treated in a dignified and safe manner. And where needed, we have also provided donations of PPE and hygiene materials. This includes not only in countries and contexts where we traditionally work in detention, as on my earlier slide, but also in contexts such as Pakistan, Indonesia, where we have worked with authorities during COVID to help support some of their responses. Next slide, please. So some concrete examples of the ICRC in detention during COVID-19. Sorry, next slide, please, if we could. There we go. So these are just a few examples of within the region. There's been a lot more work done, but given the time constraints, I just wanted to share a few sort of highlights. In the Philippines, as you already heard a bit from Father Eli, we've worked with authorities to set up 9 COVID isolation medical isolation facilities all over the country with a total capacity of around 1,100 beds. This includes at New Bilibid prison where Father Eli works and as well as several other places around the country. And these medical isolation centers are helping to support authorities to treat and look after detainees who've been infected with COVID-19 and have mild to moderate symptoms, and to ensure that the detainees receive the care that they need. In the Philippines, we also worked with authorities to develop standard operating procedures on the prevention, control, and management of COVID-19, and provided extensive training to staff on prevention control measures, as well as the management of the dead in a safe and dignified manner. In Myanmar, together with the Myanmar Red Cross, our teams provided financial support for transportation, food, as well as hygiene materials to over 2,000 detainees who were returning home after receiving a presidential pardon. In Bangladesh, we supported the renovation and equipping of 3 COVID medical isolation centers, as well as providing donations of PPE, so that's personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, and gowns and such, as well as hygiene items. In Malaysia, my counterparts in Malaysia have been working very closely with the prison authorities and the immigration authorities to provide, again, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, and hygiene items to both prisons and immigration detention centers across the country. In Afghanistan, our teams provided technical advice on how to implement the government's COVID-19 emergency response plan in prisons throughout the country. In Afghanistan's largest prisons, Policharki, we helped to install hand washing stations, donated hygiene materials and PPE, as well as provided kits to ensure the dignified management of the dead. Similar support was also provided to prisons in other parts of Afghanistan. Again, this is just a small sample of the work the ICRC has done over the last 9 months in the region to help mitigate the impact of the pandemic on detainees and staff who work in places of detention. We know that COVID-19 is a marathon and not a sprint. That is why the ICRC will continue to assess the needs and work with detainee authorities to help prevent, manage, and control COVID-19 in places of detention throughout Asia and Pacific. However, we will not lose sight of the fact that the vulnerability of detainees has only increased over the past several months, and the humanitarian challenges that places of detention faced before COVID have also become more complicated. Sustainable solutions must be found, and we'll continue to work with governments at all levels of the detention system to help adapt and address these challenges. Thank you very much for your attention. But in closing, I would just like to share a couple resources that may be of interest to you. First, sorry, if you can go back one slide, please, to COVID-19 resources. There's just 3 resources here that if you're interested in. First is the World Health Organization Europe has published this excellent guide on preparation, prevention, and control of COVID-19 in prisons and other places of detention. And also some great resources, both ICPA and Europris has links on these websites here to many other resources that have been created by organizations around the world around COVID-19 in detention. And the last slide, just wanted to highlight 3 resources that I feel are more applicable than ever, even with COVID happening right now. And these are some excellent resources the ICRC has been involved in creating. First one is the UNODC ICRC Handbook on Strategies to Reduce Overcrowding in Prison. It's a great resource that outlines the complexity of prison overcrowding and practical strategies to address those challenges. Also, our ICRC Towards Humane Prisons book. It's a participatory guide to prison planning and design that helps when people are planning to build a prison or to design a prison, to look at it from again the lens of detainees, the lens of the community, and others when designing a new facility. And again, finally, our Human Rights Approach to Prison Management, the 3rd edition, was released last year by the Institute of Crime and Justice Policy Research in the UK, and that was done in cooperation with the ICRC. So thank you very much, and I will turn the floor back to you, Lani.
Thank you very much, Sir Terry. Okay, there is a question, automatic. Hello, Terry. Would like to know what is the response of ICRC concerning the call, concerning the call, okay, all right, okay. So maybe this can be answered bilaterally to Sir Terry, since it's specific in the Philippine context.
Actually, Lani, let me just tackle that briefly for a second.
Sure.
Yeah, and James, thanks for the question. And this speaks to our confidentiality, the work that we do with governments. And detaining authorities. So we don't talk about those confidential dialogue. We don't talk about what we see. We talk about what we do, from what I shared with you. So, in terms of our reaction, we share and we have regular dialogue with the government of the Philippines on many issues, including obviously the issues with congestion in the prisons and various things that may come up from time to time. So we do have ongoing dialogue. But we don't comment publicly on those discussions. Oh, Lani, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry, thank you, Terry. And one more, do you have any project in Indonesia? This comes from Father Suyadi, SJ.
Yes, Father. Yeah, so I briefly touched on it during my presentation that we don't have a significant detention operation in Indonesia. However, during COVID-19, we have done some, most recently, there was a partnership between the ICRC and I believe the government of Korea in terms of distribution of items and like hygiene items, PPE, to the prison authorities. So we obviously have delegations everywhere. Well, quite not everywhere, but many countries in the region. But because of our significant, because of resources, obviously we only focus on certain countries where we have a full multidisciplinary detention team. But yes, we are doing some work in Indonesia, and we can provide you some information bilaterally as well. And yes, we can send you the resources in the email, or even I can, if I'm quick enough, put the links in the chat here.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sir Terry. That would be appreciated by our 122 participants, more or less. And then also our shout out to our YouTube viewers, because we are also being streamed on YouTube. So hello to our viewers, and thank you for taking the time to listen to our webinar this afternoon, Detention in Asia and the Pacific. So before I turn it over to our very important partner, we would just like to inform our participants that the certificates would be ready in 3 days for those who requested it after you answer the survey, because it's also very important for us to know your feedback and what you want ICRC and Sanata Dharma and the Jesuit Conference in Asia-Pacific to tackle next, maybe by next year. So without further ado, this would not have been possible had it not been for this very important person, as I've mentioned earlier. I now turn over the room to the Dean of Sanata Dharma University Faculty of Theology, President of the Haii Pontifical Faculty of Theology, Father Bagus Laksana, SJ. Over to you, Father.
Thank you, Lani. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the speakers in particular, Ms. Julie Edwards from Australia, Father Eli Lumbo from the Philippines, Mr. Terry Hackett from Manila, and everyone. I'm very privileged, I feel, to be able to host, in a way, this first series in the webinar series that we have planned together jointly by the Jesuit networks of universities in Asia and then the ICRC networks. As we can see, the discussion is very rich. The presentation is very important and timely for our region that is facing a huge problem in terms of detention and all its problems, concomitant problems, as we have seen. So allow me to offer my thoughts and reflections on what we have been doing thus far for 2 hours almost. First, it strikes me that we are meeting virtually. Many of us have known each other in one way or another, but I think the great majority of us in this virtual room are meeting for the first time. It's very joyful to see all the new faces coming from different parts of Asia and the Pacific, Australia, and also beyond. And it's for me striking again to see how our discussion in virtual kind of room platform is virtual in one way, but on different levels, we are touching on the real lives of people. We see the human stories being told and retold, and we are inspired by those stories. Father Eli, for example, was telling us stories about the encounters, intimate encounters, emotional, very human encounters between son and mother and so forth, encounters with detainees and their families. And this is beautiful. And one of the participants actually was asking questions to Father Eli. Why do you have that kind of personality? Why are you becoming so strong in your service? because your story is inspiring to some of the participants or all the participants on that, for that matter. So again, I have this impression that we are meeting virtually, but what we are talking about, what we are discussing is not some abstract thing or theme or question, but rather it touches on the real lives of people. And it's very beautiful in itself. And I feel that by the end of this conversation, we are not alone. We are enlarging our networks, the Jesuit networks, the ICRC network, the humanitarian networks in general. Everyone in this room have been participating in this enlargement of networks. And at the end of the day, again, we are not feeling alone doing this, and we are together in all this, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic, in a way, heightens the sense that we are isolated. We cannot meet in person. We cannot help others in ways that were possible before the pandemic. But by discussing all those things together in those manners that we did so far, we feel the sense that we are not alone, and the prisoners, the detainees, and their families are not alone either. We touched on their lives on different manners. We explained the programs. Terry just finished the presentation on how to deal with all those things more or less globally or regionally. And Father Eli touches on the more regional part of it, or country project with the Jesuit networks, with Australia, with the Julie Edwards network as well. This is the enlargement of the networks, and we hope that in the future we can do a lot more among us. And I think going forward, I'm reminded by this message of Pope Francis in his newest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, on fraternity and social friendship, because Julie and Father Eli, but also Terry, I think, all mentioned the need to galvanize support for the abolition of capital punishment, death penalty. The Pope, in his encyclical, is just doing this as one of those important messages of this Holy Father for all of us, for Christians, for all people with goodwill, for all of us here in the spiritual room in our networks. So I think going forward, we can talk about this more. Our faculty here at Sanata Dharma University has had this kind of conference on the abolition of death penalty in Indonesia. It was, I mean, a very tense discussion. It is pretty hard to move forward sometimes on this topic. But with this enlarged network, I think we can do better for the benefits of those prisoners or those who come from, as Julie mentioned, a very disadvantaged stratum of the society. Father Eli also mentioned this. Those prisoners, detainees, come from the lowest strata of society. They don't just come from any kind of part of the society, but there is this connection to the idea of social justice as well. So I think going forward, we can talk more about that, separate webinar perhaps. And also, I think the last one is that we have been inspired. I myself have been inspired during this conversation on the more personal level as well. The stories about the kind of good things, services, different services, a whole range of services that all of you, the networks, the ICRC networks, as well as the Jesuit networks, have been doing, offering to those detainees, their families, but also society in general. That's very beautiful, and I'm inspired that we might start to have that kind of work in our place, prison ministry, even in our faculty. We can do something about that, and we are inspired by your stories, by your services so far. So Father Eli, at the end of his presentation, talk about the spark, that enkindles the other person. We can receive the sparks from other persons as well. And what I see here among us is that we are spark to each other, or something like that. We are inspiring each other on this journey of service to humanity, to detainees in particular and their families. But also in the next two webinar series, we will talk about education in conflict times and areas, access to education that is very timely during our COVID-19 pandemic season, but also about forced displacement, another crucial social issue in our time, in our region as well. So I thank you, Lani, very good moderator who moderated our session so well. And the participants, but also the speakers in particular, Father Eli, Terry Hackett, and also Miss Julie Edwards. Thank you, coming all the way, so to speak, from Australia. Also, Father, Pak Rector, the President of Sanata Dharma University, that makes everything possible here, facilitating our Zoom meeting. Also, Dominic Earnshaw from the ICRC. It's our privilege to be able to join in this conversation and to host this for all of us. So see you next time in our webinar series. Thank you.
You're on mute, Lani. Lani, you are on mute.
I turn it now over to Pak Budi, who is our masters of this ceremony. Over to you, Pak.
Thank you, Lani, and thank you all speakers, distinguished speakers, to share your very thoughtful presentation, and to our organizers, Pak Bagus, Pak Rektor, Dominic, and Amin from the Philippines, our colleague who's been behind the scene of all this. And for all interested participants, just a small reminder that we will continue this webinar next month on the 20th of November. And for those who are interested, please just register through ICRC website or Sanata Dharma website in the due course. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon for all. Thank you.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Asgarius.
Thank you so much.
The link of the survey or evaluation can be found in the chat box to our participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miss Lani.
Thank you, Miss Lani.
Thank you, Miss Lani.
Thank you. Terima kasih. We hope to see you next time. Salamat po.
Selamat sore sama-sama.
Selamat sore.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Kayus.
Obrigado all.
Thank you, Kakari.
Hari community work.
Thank you, Asgarius. Thank you, Anjas.
Okay.
Thank you, Anjas.
Thank you, Jacob Panga. How are you?